I'm Lee Milan, and in this video we're going to look at Ableton Live's Max for Live modulators. Now, Max for Live within Ableton Live has always been this addition of custom or homemade plugins that you can add into the environment. And slowly over the different releases, more and more Max for Live devices have become part of the Ableton Live library. So we're going to focus firstly on these modulator devices, which is in audio effects and modulators. We have an envelope follower, an LFO, and a shaper device. We're going to focus on one first and then look at the others, but these are all designed to be able to affect the properties of a parameter somewhere within your project. So in synthesis, modulation would normally be that a LFO or an envelope can change the properties of, let's say, a filter position, or maybe the amplitude of the sound of the synthesizer. This is a similar principle, except we're modulating anything in our project. So it basically turns Ableton Live into a modular environment. So starting with the first device, envelope follower. If I press play on the drum beat, we'll get a sense of what's going on. So you can see that the drum beat is playing on the display, and the yellow line is basically the modulation it will take from that audio signal, and we can apply that somewhere else. So for instance, I can hit map, and I can map the actual envelope follower to the reverb send of that drum track, and now that will sympathetically move up and down as the drums increase in volume. Okay, so a couple of things to get used to when we're using these modulated devices is that map function for a start. So if you want to get rid of a mapping, we can remove that there. Once you've mapped something, you can choose the range of its lowest and highest position it can go to. So at the moment, it's set to the full range, 0% being the send effects being all the way down, and then 100% being it all the way to the right. So as long as the actual signal going in is creating a loud enough or a large enough range for the modulation, then that 0 to 100% can truly get from the very left to the very right position of that parameter. We can reverse the polarity, so we can make it so when the audio of the drum beat is down at its lowest level, the actual mapping will be to the right position of the parameter, and we can reverse that highest position of the modulation to now be the lowest position of what it's mapped to. So we'll have the opposite effect. We're effectively reducing the reverb as the drums get louder. Okay, so that's the rudimentary parts of how we do mapping. If we want to map to more than one destination, with these newer Max for Live devices, the ones that look like this, rather than if we just pull up an older looking one, if I go to MIDI effects here, we load up one of the older looking Max for Live devices. As long as it looks like this style one here, we have this drop-down box which brings multiple destinations for our mapping. So as well as reverb, I can also map this to, let's say, the delay. And now both of those will jump up and down with a drum beat. And then just minimize that to get rid of it. The shape of the envelope follower can be altered. So at the moment it's trying its best to accurately follow the contours of the volume of the drum beat at the moment, but we can modify that. So if we want it to take a little while for it to rise up after the drum beat has sounded, each main loud transient, we can change the rise time, which is equivalent to what an attack time can be when we're dealing with envelopes on a synthesizer. And you can see that the actual modulation line there has started having a curve to go up to its full value rather than immediately going up like the drums do. The fall is the same, but it's more like a release. So it's how long it takes for it to go from its actual modulation position down to its resting lowest position. So if I increase that as it plays, you'll see. So either very fast and reactive, or takes a little longer to go down to its resting position. And then we generally have a delay that we can change as well. So the actual time it takes to make the modulation is delayed and offset. like a pre-delay that you get on a reverb really. And you could see that the actual audio waveform of the drum beat in the envelope is earlier than the modulation line, that yellow line. Okay, so other options that we generally will have here is ways of choosing how we can be synchronized. So at the moment, the delay is done in milliseconds, but we can move that to a synchronized value and work in synchronized divisions of the beat or bar as well. So that's the envelope follower covered. Let's have a look at the next one. So we go to audio effects again, and let's go to LFO this time. So the LFO isn't going to follow the drum beat shape or anything like that, because that's the function of the envelope follower. It's following the volume changes of the signal that's going through it. The LFO itself is more like a freestanding LFO that we'd get within a synthesizer. So an LFO is a low frequency oscillator. An oscillator is a sound creator. So at the moment it's a sine wave, so it's a pure frequency. We're not getting any additional information in there, but one continuous waveform. At the moment, it's set to be a free-form rate, so it's set in actual hertz. If we want it to be more musical, we can set it to a synced rate, so it actually will follow the beats and measures within the tempo of what we're working at. Again, we can map this to something else in our project. So I've actually got a pad sound here. So what I might do is just move the LFO over to my pad sound. And let's add something to change the audio properties of the pad. Okay, so that sounds interesting. So I'm going to hit map on the LFO and apply that to the fine control. So let's just take the drums out for a minute and focus on that pad sound. Okay, so a couple of things are different from what the LFO is doing compared to what I was doing when I was manually moving that parameter. So at the moment, it's a bipolar parameter I've mapped this to. So its central and neutral position is the center 12 o'clock position. And my LFO is swinging this position up, above, and then down below that centralized position. If I want that to only reach 0 and work upwards from there, I can change the range of the mapping to 50%. And then it will only move to that central position and upwards. So it's swinging above that centralized position. Okay, a couple of other useful things we can have on the LFO to play with. We've still got that multi-map version here where we can add more modulations and map it to other destinations. We can change the depth. So at the moment, it's going between the 0 point there, so the central position of the parameter, and all the way up to, in this case, 500 hertz, which is the top position of this parameter. If we change the depth, we can make it a lot more subtle. Now at the moment, I've made the range a lot smaller, but it's moved up and away from that centralized position. So we've got two options here. We can either try and offset that here by changing that min-max range. And if you want it to be symmetrical, set it by the same offset. So if I go for 25 there and 75 there, in the middle is 50%, so that will be swinging either way equally. Or alternatively, I could set that back to 50 and that back to 100, and instead use this offset position, which actually changes the position of the waveform inside the LFO. We can get to a similar control of the range. A combination of the two, we can pull that in and get it to where we want it to be behavior-wise. Okay, so let's just set this back to how it was before. Let's have a look at the other options we have here. We have jitter. So the LFO is completely predictable right now. It's going up and down by the same amount every time, and it will do it until we stop playback, right? If we put in jitter, we introduce an aspect of randomness to that waveform. So now, as the term means, to be jittery, so uncertain and unpredictable. So we've made that to the LFO. We've added that to it. So it's still got its main contour of going up and down, but we have some additional randomness to it. finally, we have a smooth control, which can help smooth out the shape of the waveform as well. Okay, so that's our LFO covered in the majority of assignments it can have. Let's have a look at the other modulator device, which is our shaper, which is not too dissimilar from the LFO, except this one works more over time. So rather than it being just a repeatable LFO, we can have different shapes that happen within the actual modulation time period of this modulator itself. So I can do this very quickly by just loading in a shape that's got multiple movements to it. And then let's map this to exactly the same place so we hear it in the same context. So I'm just going to remove the mapping here from the LFO and replace it with this one here. So let's change the rate and slow this right down. So as you can see, it's more like a sequenced movement of modulation rather than just a repeating shape that we had within LFO beforehand. So far we've been looking at envelope follower, LFO, and shaper. And these have all been audio effects. So they're in the audio effects folder in the modulators. There are, however, some other effects available for the same kind of purpose, but they live in a different category, which is MIDI effects. So if I go to MIDI effects, we have envelope MIDI here. If I drag this to a new track, at the moment this will do nothing because we haven't set it up, but it's basically the same as our envelope follower, except a MIDI note will make it actually start and play. So the other option that we have here, if we go to Max for Live itself, and we go to the MIDI effects section, we have LFO MIDI. If you don't have this, go to the Ableton Live website and go to your account and download the Max for Live Essentials pack. It's in there and it's part of the actual installation process. So I'm going to grab the LFO MIDI as well. So to put this into context, I'm going to load in just a stock kind of sound source. And you'll notice in this case, the actual devices are before this instrument because they're still MIDI orientated. They won't produce sound or process sound. They just respond to the MIDI data and then they can be mapped to other parts of your Ableton Live environment. So I'm going to just remove the other parts in this project, just play something kind of low to put context into how we can use these devices for modulation. So I'll play this short clip. Just put it down one more octave. Okay, now modulation is already happening here. I just played with an envelope on operator and I've modulated part of its properties. We're looking at doing modulation that's separate from the instrument itself. So I'm going to drag in something that might just add a nice color of sound to this sound that I've created with operator. Okay, so that being moved has an interesting tone to it. So I'm going to go to map on the LFO MIDI and map that there. Set it to sync and set it to something rhythmic to go with the tempo. Okay, so at the moment that's synchronized, that's running off the actual transport or the playback and tempo of Ableton Live. What I can do instead though is open up this little show button, which allows me to tell the LFO to be triggered by MIDI instead. So if I choose re-trigger, you'll notice the shape of the LFO will instead restart when the two walking notes that are playing now, they're dun, 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 dun. Each time one of those notes plays, it will trigger the LFO and restart it again. So now it will behave a lot more like a synthesizer does. Okay, so with retrigger turned off, it's just running, and wherever the note's played, there's no association between the two, but with retrigger turned on. So if you did rapid, fast notes, it would keep restarting that LFO with it as well. So it becomes unified with the instrument. So on a similar nature, let's have a look at envelope MIDI, and let's find another sonic variator to this sound. So I'm going to reach for, let's go for Redux this time. And again, find something that sounds good in context. Let's go for that. So I'm going to find the map button for envelope and assign that to the rate control. Now we're going to have a slight issue here. If I just minimize the size of these by double clicking the title bar, we've got a readout here which is in hertz, and we're working with a mapping of the modulation which is in percent. So we have to do this by eye. I was playing with the area between 12 o'clock and around about 2 o'clock just then. So I'll have it that it will start around 2 o'clock, and then I want it to pull the dial further to the left when the envelope rises up and goes to its highest modulation position. Okay, so just as a synthesizer works, I've now got an envelope which is being triggered by a note to modulate something else in the project. So far, we've looked at the modulator devices. So we've looked at the envelope follower, which can allow audio to be, or the shape of the audio to be mapped to another destination or another parameter. We've looked at the shaper, which allows us to do rhythmic modulations and assign those to things. And we've looked at the LFO MIDI, which can be the MIDI device, as I just mentioned, or it can be an audio device as well. And then finally, we have the MIDI envelope follower as well, which is triggered by a MIDI note, but can be mapped to something else in your project. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the fact we've looked at the audio and the MIDI versions of some of these devices is there's a behavior with Max for Live when we're mapping, which you need to be aware of, especially as you might want to add more and more to your project as you explore this type of technique. So Ableton Live audio devices, when they're mapping, their speed of mapping from destination or source to destination is affected by the latency of your audio buffer. So if I go to preferences here and I go to my buffer size, the smaller the samples it takes to produce the audio when you request it to, the lower the latency. But that adds more demand on your computer. So the higher the latency, or the more samples it takes to produce that audio when requested, the higher the latency, but the less strain it puts on your computer. So Max for Live audio devices, when they're mapping, are based on the time of your latency. So what can be short and snappy, let's say an envelope follower following a hi-hat pattern, and you've mapped it to control a filter on another sound, what could be really tight and in time when you're at a low latency will get later and later in its mapping time when you go to a higher latency. So I've created some audio examples of this to try and make it as clear as possible. So at the moment I have a noise source, which I'm calling my live trigger. So this is happening right now, it's not recorded. So my live sound is this. And then my live mapping is this sawtooth kind of pad sound. And I've mapped envelope follower to the gain control of this utility. So it's effectively turned the volume up and down on this other instrument. Not necessarily something you do with those particular tools, but very clear to hear and see what's going on. So at the moment, we're just hearing the noise, and then as I turn on the envelope follower, it will start turning up the volume of the pad sound. Okay, so at the moment, I have a low latency setting, so they're more or less happening at the same time. The envelope follower is following the noise sound and then telling the volume of the pad to go up and down. Now, what happens when we increase our latency is the time of that modulation happening is increased, as I mentioned already. So let's listen to that. So at 32 samples, which is an incredibly low latency setting on a computer, it's this fast between the noise and the pad sound being turned up and down. Okay, now at the highest latency, so the biggest delay between telling the sound when it wants to play and you hearing it, sounds like this. So for very time accurate based mapping, we need to make sure that we use a very low latency system, or where possible, use the Max for Live MIDI modulator devices. In this video, we've looked at a variety of modulator devices with Max for Live. Ones that can work as audio processors, or work in the audio section of Ableton Live, or ones that will work in the MIDI section of Ableton Live as well. And we've also looked at the very important difference between those two types of devices, the inherent delay that will happen based on your audio buffer settings when you're using Max for Live audio devices.